Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The United States is set to go ahead with its withdrawal of troops from Germany, even though at some level Donald Trump has said that he may very well walk that back if Germany, in his eyes, once again starts spending enough, or actually spends enough. It has not yet spent enough in his eyes towards, of course, NATO spending specifically. That's been a bone of contention for a while now, as we know, on the part of Donald Trump towards Europe, especially Germany as well. Now, there have been many reasons brought forth about why the U.S. may make this decision at this point to withdraw from Germany, or to withdraw a significant number of troops from Germany, that is. Donald Trump is insistent this has to do with that defense spending. Nevertheless, other U.S. officials, such as Mark Esper and others, have said that, in fact, the U.S. is trying to have a leaner presence in Europe overall and to concentrate in areas where they would be able to, quote-unquote, keep an eye on Russia more effectively. What is the truth? Is it as Trump says, or is it as other U.S. officials tell us at this time? The Germans, of course, are not happy about this move at this time, as are many, even within the U.S., bipartisan opposition to this decision at this time. Let's put that to our guests who are joining us. Joining us from Akron in Ohio is Karl Kaltenthaler, who is a professor and director of security studies at the University of Akron. Joining us from Athens currently is Uli Brueckner, who is a German political analyst and Jean Monnet professor at Stanford University Overseas Studies Center. He is usually based in Berlin. Uli and Karl, thank you both for your time today. Karl, let me start with you. What do you think is the reality here, the truth here about why this decision is being made at this time? Is it as negative as being presented by Donald Trump, where it's just the U.S. versus Germany over NATO spending, or is this, in fact, a good effort in some ways to have a leaner presence in Europe?
From what I've heard, it seems that it's got more to do with Trump's attitude towards Germany and less having to do with a leaner presence in Europe, or in Germany in particular. It's important to note that these troops would be repositioned within Europe. They would not be leaving Europe, so it wouldn't be so much a leaner presence in Europe. It would be simply a repositioning of the troops. Now, having said that, I think it's important to look at the relationship that Trump has had with Merkel. The relationship, I would characterize it as being a fairly rocky, if not frosty relationship. Clearly from his body language and things he said when he meets with her, he does not like her. I think he looks at her as challenging to his image internationally. She's viewed very positively. If you look at public opinion, he's not viewed typically very positively. They have very, very different views of the world. She is a convinced multilateralist. Obviously, he's a convinced nationalist. His main slogan is America First. So if you look at that in the context of that kind of relationship, I think one of the things that's driving this is that he's simply unhappy with her, and he's in a way trying to punish the Germans. So it's not simply about spending. I think it's a way to indicate his displeasure with the Germans. It could be as simple or as straightforward as her saying that she wasn't going to physically come to the G7 summit. And that was very embarrassing to him. He took it personally. And then you started to see him push pretty strongly at that point for moving a significant number of troops out of Germany. So I don't think this is really about repositioning or making a leaner U.S. presence in Europe.
All right, Uli is back. Uli, if you can hear me clearly, what are your thoughts about what may be the real reasons behind this Trump decision, right? Karl there mentioned the fact that it's pretty clear that Merkel and Trump don't really get along and don't agree on many, many issues. Does this come down to, do you think, his personal, possibly dislike of Merkel, and he may be wanting to punish Germany at some level, of course, not completely just for that reason, or what do you think may be happening behind the scenes?
Well, I don't think that it matters in the 21st century if kings and queens like each other or if there are personal animosities. This is about a message to the American electorate that Germany is way too liberal, and he looks down on a female German leader, and he sends a signal that, as he puts it, Germany owes billions and billions to NATO, which is nonsense as such, because NATO doesn't have a budget and no one pays in. Everyone covers the expenses as part of a NATO mission. So this is clearly a domestic message. It is not a question of what does it change security-wise in Europe, because as it was already said, the headquarters will be moved from Stuttgart to Mons in Belgium, and it doesn't change a thing in terms of the American commitment in Europe and Germany as a NATO member. So this is not about a strategic decision that has anything to do with the role of Germany. This is clearly a signal to the American electorate that a strong American president can punish a partner that is not really a partner, but someone who receives orders from the hegemon, and this hopefully resonates within the conservative community in the United States. This is what it's about.
Karl, one of the things that's interesting about this is that, because Donald Trump's publicly stated reason for doing this, at least, is that 2% NATO spending. I keep going back to that because, again, that's the only reason that's publicly being spoken of, especially directly from Donald Trump, that is, not other officials. It's interesting because Belgium and Italy actually spend less than Germany, from what I've understood, of course, on NATO. So that sort of also doesn't make sense. And secondly, it's also been revealed that this entire withdrawal and the move to the likes of Belgium and Italy will cost a lot of money, and it will take a significant amount of time. I mean, I wonder if all of this is really worth it.
Well, that's a good question. And for most of the people who I've talked to in the American national security establishment, this is not worth it. This is extremely costly. The net benefit from this to the United States in terms of cost savings is negative. It will also take years to accomplish. This is not something that can be done in a matter of weeks. It would take years. And so it's entirely possible that this is simply political rhetoric. I think Uli's right to say that part of this is a message to the American electorate, although I would say I think most of the American electorate's really not focused on this at all. Foreign policy typically is not a very important thing in American elections. And everybody's here pretty concentrated on the coronavirus and the economy and the racial justice protests that we've had in the country and the reaction to that. But I think it's a message from Trump that leaders who he thinks make him look bad will pay a political price. And I truly believe he thinks Angela Merkel makes him look bad. I mean, if you look at the way he's treated her when they've met, I've not seen him treat any other national leader the same way. So I think that's a big part of this dynamic.
Okay, so Uli, you've mentioned that this doesn't necessarily mean a drawdown of the U.S., right? This just means that they'll be deployed in other places. But nevertheless, I wanted to broach the Russia aspect of all of this, right? Because this is important, and many people who are critical of this move say that this will in fact hurt NATO and will in fact hurt the stand against Russia, the European stand against Russia as well, of course. Nevertheless, there's another aspect which isn't spoken of a lot, at least right now within this specific decision, is that of Nord Stream 2, right? And the U.S. being quite angry about that pipeline going ahead. And German officials from now, from what I've understood, are still sticking by that pipeline with the Russians. And the Americans still want to market their LNG to Europe also. Do you think that there's almost somewhat of a business aspect to this as well?
Of course there's a business aspect. The United States want to sell liquefied gas. Germany could potentially buy more from the United States. Given the current price of oil and gas, it doesn't really make sense to consider this as an option. And the European Union is trying hard to diversify its pipeline connections and its energy mix. And as part of this, Germany decided to diversify its pipeline connections, which caused major outcries, not only in the United States, but also in transit countries like Poland and the Ukraine and Belarus. But since the 1970s, Germany has imported a huge amount of gas from Russia, and Russia has always been the most reliable supplier because they need the money, and Germany needed energy. This is no longer as important as it was in the past because we have a much more diversified energy mix. But it's clearly about American business interests, as it is also clearly about American business interests. If Germany increases spending, it most likely will buy American weapon technology. And this is an important signal sent to the German partner.
All right, Karl, a final word then. On the issue of Russia, firstly, of course, I want to get your thoughts on the business aspect of this, but do you think that there's also a security aspect of this? Will this hurt NATO and European security in some way in the face of what's perceived as Russian aggression?
Well, I think it does send a message to the U.S.'s NATO partners that we're, once again, maybe not the most reliable partner that they could have. Other countries are going to wonder if they're going to be treated the same way as Germany is. And so it creates a increased sense that Trump is somebody who you have to be very cautious about. It increases the sense that, maybe the United States is not the stalwart ally against Russia that it once was. This increases a lot of concern, a lot of anxiety, and I think it makes the Europeans look for not to look for a completely different option than NATO, but maybe there's something else that could be done, more dependence on each other rather than the United States. I think a lot of Europeans are looking at the November election because they think, well, maybe that will change the American attitude and we'll go back to what it was before Donald Trump was president.
Very well. We'll leave there a word, but we appreciate both of our guests for their time and insight today. Karl, they were speaking to us from Akron, and Uli, they were speaking to us from Athens. They've put into context first, right, this decision of Donald Trump. Will it even really happen? Because as with many Trump decisions, he's already sort of shown an opening, saying that if Germany were to once again, or to start spending, in fact, 2% of his GDP on NATO spending as he is required and demanded from many other countries as well who are members of NATO, then he would reverse this decision. That seems to at least been the message that's come out over the past 24 hours. Nevertheless, Belgium, Italy, where these troops would move to, are in fact spending less for NATO, so that doesn't really make sense. What exactly is happening behind the scenes? Is it business interests, as Uli there had also mentioned? Does it have really to do with Russia and that aspect, or is this all just to do with the United States versus the EU in some fashion? And would then the Europeans, and should then the Europeans possibly be looking to defend themselves independently of NATO as well at this time, considering Donald Trump functions in this fashion, and which is very unclear about what exactly he wants to achieve by this, considering it's going to cost a lot of money and will take a lot of time to achieve this sort of withdrawal, especially the way it's being laid out for the rest of us. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Donald Trump's decision to rescind the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, AFFH, which is an Obama-era program that was designed to reduce racial segregation in America's suburbs. Now, that's, of course, a very important issue, considering their long-standing criticism, of course, of racial segregation in neighborhoods across the United States for various reasons, especially, of course, because of the now we have the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot more awareness about that. So all of that is now coming to the fore as well and being discussed openly, as it has, of course, in the past years as well. Now, Donald Trump says that this AFFH program simply had too many rules and regulations in place and put too much of the onus on communities to follow federal rules, and they interfere too much with zoning, et cetera, and that his new rule is in fact leaner and better and would also not be discriminatory. Nevertheless, the language that has been used by Donald Trump when he's spoken about this rule, saying things like, the destruction of America's suburbs, et cetera, that has obviously made a lot of the critics uneasy, especially if he does still want racial segregation in neighborhoods to end or not. I'll put that now to our guests who are joining us to discuss this further. We're now joined by Mark Riley, who is a veteran New York broadcaster and political analyst. He's usually based in New York, but is joining us today from Brighton in the UK. Joining us from New York is Oscar Odom III, who is a former first deputy commissioner of New York City, a retired NYPD detective, and is currently a college professor. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Rashawn Ray, who is a Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution. Rashawn, Oscar, and Mark, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Oscar, let me start with you. What are your thoughts about AFFH? Should it have been rescinded in this fashion? What do you think about the replacement? Are the concerns here valid?
Well, obviously there's some concerns possibly about the intent or how some people will view this new policy. However, the policy with the opportunity zone. But if you look at it on the other side, I look at the opportunity zone also as a place to rebuild the neighborhoods that may have been cut out before because the programs were going other place. And if you look at it from New York City in a gentrification lens, what happens in New York City is that we have a lot of people that have moved back to the neighborhoods anyway. So it's not like they were going away from the neighborhoods, but they moved back and they're building up the neighborhoods in which they moved into. And years ago or decades ago, they would have been seen in those neighborhoods, but now they are there. So the opportunity zone provides something to build up the neighborhoods that are there, as opposed to taking people to say, you come over here and you be there, as though coming over there is definitely going to make you something by going over there. So I can look at it the other way also and say, thank you, you're building up the other neighborhoods, and there's gentrification taking place in New York City in which people are moving back to these neighborhoods anyway. So I'm fine.
Rashawn, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think maybe it is a bit too early for us to criticize Trump? Sure, he may not have presented this in the nicest way, but maybe we need to actually study the newer policy more?
So I think we have to be very realistic about Trump's tweets, as well as what he's aiming to do with this legislation, with really rolling back this legislation. Really what it's aiming to do is roll back the progress that was made as it relates to the civil rights movement. We already know with Shelby versus Holder over the past decade that the Voting Rights Act has been dismantled. People are asking for a new Voting Rights Act to be named after the late now John Lewis. And when it comes to thinking about housing, we know that the Fair Housing Act from 1968, that of course other presidents, including President Obama, has doubled down on, is aiming to be dismantled by Trump. The bottom line is this: Trump is trying to pull out things from his hat to actually help voters try to get on board with him. And we're seeing that that's not happening overwhelmingly. And what this type of tweet and this type of legislation is aiming to do is sending out a dog whistle that low-income people, which oftentimes people perceive to be Black and Latino, are going to come into your neighborhood and commit crime. And oftentimes people are just trying to have a better way of life. So part of what we have to realize is that what's happening with Trump is that he is trying to actually dismantle fair housing policies, and it will lead to more discrimination against Blacks and Latinos and low-income people.
Okay, so, obviously that isn't what Donald Trump himself has stated, and Ben Carson has not stated that either, saying, in fact, the very opposite, as you well know, that, this is, in fact, going to not have, even the new legislation will ensure discrimination ends when it comes to housing policies. Who do you believe?
Well, it's very difficult to believe Donald Trump on this level. Historically, he and his father had to sign off on a discrimination lawsuit going back to the early 1970s. This is nothing new for him, looking as though having low income, which he considers to be Black people in particular neighborhoods, will destroy those neighborhoods. The fact of the matter is, Westchester County, which is just outside New York City, signed an agreement and built 750 units of housing in affluent areas for low-income people. And the fact of the matter is the crime rate did not go up and the housing prices did not go down. So I don't know what his rationale is for trying to say that these are the results of the AFFH. It boggles the mind that he's grasping at these kinds of straws. The fact of the matter is, part of the reason why he's doing this is he won the suburbs in America by about 4 points 4 years ago. And right now the polling has him well below that number. And in fact, Joe Biden beating him by double digits. If you want to know why he's doing this now, that's the reason.
Oscar, what's on that? Do you think this is an election ploy? And then secondly, if I may ask you, how important is it, of course, to ensure that we end racial segregation as it currently may exist on the ground there within communities? Don't we need to have all communities living side by side and to sort of have that ensured by the government?
Oh, most definitely we need to have that ensured by the government, that we live side by side when it comes to things of this nature. Like I said, the lens in which I look at it, and as stated earlier by one of the previous panelists, is that crimes have not gone up in these areas when people have moved into the areas. Actually, what happened is they adapted, assimilated, whatever term you want to use, and things worked out fine for them when they moved into these neighborhoods. So the crime didn't go up. So that can, of course, be an appeasement to other people to have the perception or the fear that when they move in, that the crime is going to go up. And it's not going to go up. When people have moved into the neighborhoods, everything went well, property values did not go down, and the people were fine. However, the other part is, like I said, I enjoy and welcome the part of building up our communities by making sure that you feeding some money into our communities and that we're building up, because people are flocking to our communities now. They weren't flocking before, but they are coming in by the droves in our communities. In New York City, you could look at Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights, East New York section, Harlem. I mean, it is flooded. People are just running to these neighborhoods. So if you're going to put money in there and build it up and we're going to prosper at the same time, that's fine. However, we must always keep the intent in mind of why this is being done. And, of course, to some who see this, it's fear mongering, whatever, or to have the people think that, the crime is going to go up and this is going to be your worst fear. But it's unlike that. So that's basically just a perception. And, of course, you may have some people who may buy into that, but then there's others who see it and they don't buy into that. Because, like I said, if you walk through Harlem now, if you walk through Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, you will see a big change.
Okay, so then, Rashawn, for the rest of us on the outside, just to put this into context first, if you can, just the bare basics, right? Why is it important to have low-income housing within these communities as well? Like, why is it important to have this sort of integration at this level? What does that achieve? I mean, I did read a Harvard study which says this has been fairly successful so far and has not, as Oscar there mentioned, not brought property prices down, has not increased crime rates, as all of you mentioned as well.
So it's important to have fair housing because we know historically that fair housing hasn't been something that we've had in the United States. So we actually need legislation in place to ensure that we're going to have equitable housing. And this is the other reason why. We know that if we go back to the 70s and 80s, that white suburban families that are now there engaged in extreme white flight where they left urban areas. They left Black and Latino families and neighborhoods behind. They also took resources with them as they engaged in white flight. And now we know, as Blacks and Latinos have went to the suburbs to gain access to larger homes, better home prices for the amount of space that you get, to also get access to better schools, then now we're seeing gentrification coming back, where now people are being displaced and outpriced of the neighborhoods that they've maintained. So this is part of a long legacy in the United States that really has roots with redlining that transition to how we think about white flight and gentrification. So we have to put that in context that the suburbs look drastically different now. The suburbs in Washington, D.C., the suburbs in Atlanta, the suburbs of Detroit, the suburbs of Baltimore, the suburbs of L.A. look drastically different than they did 30 years ago. And so this is Trump's way of sending a loud dog whistle to his base, to those 11% of white people who voted for Obama in 2012 and then switched to Trump in 2016. Trump has lost those people, and we have to be very clear about the historical legacy and the importance of fair housing policies in the United States.
Okay, Mark, I'll give you the final word, under a minute if you can. This then all, I mean, it bothers me because we're essentially saying that a lot of these white voters will possibly jump ship because Donald Trump is essentially in some ways sort of connecting with them at some racist level. I mean, that's disturbing, isn't it, in the year 2020?
It's disturbing, but as Rashawn pointed out, it's very important for people to know that a lot of folks don't buy into this anymore. We're talking about many, many decades of restrictive covenants, of redlining. And the one thing that people don't really pay close attention to here is the fact that residential segregation actually has an impact on education. Because education, with the exception of New York City and some other large cities across the country, education is paid largely through property taxes. So the fact of the matter is, if you're not living in a particular community and contributing to property taxes, your education, your children's education is going to eventually suffer. So the two are inextricably linked, and people don't always understand that.
That's a very good point. We'll have to end it at that, but we sincerely appreciate all three of our guests. That was Mark, they're speaking to us from Brighton, Oscar was speaking to us from New York, and Rashawn was speaking to us from Washington. They've all put into context for us, made us understand a bit better what this will mean possibly going forward, right? And what AFFH may have already achieved so far. It tried to, at least, ensure fair housing. Doesn't necessarily mean it, of course, achieved all of its goals, but nevertheless, it's important to end that sort of racial segregation. And if we see this in the light, as Rashawn there had mentioned, if Donald Trump is actually trying to connect to a white voting base, even at a small level, which sees this sort of racial integration into neighborhoods as a bad thing, that's quite disturbing, isn't it, in the year 2020? However minute that amount of people may be. Of course, it's not a generalization of all white people in the U.S. But nevertheless, even if it's a small number, that's still disturbing, and that should possibly be tackled head-on as well, especially considering we're now talking about racism so much more openly and dealing with it, hopefully, in a lot more open a fashion as well throughout government organizations and private institutions, both in the U.S. and around the world. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. In this segment, we're going to discuss the Iraqi Interior Ministry, which has warned that criminal groups, quote unquote, are at work in Tahrir Square in Baghdad in those protests that are still and now taking place once again, even though we now have a new prime minister in office, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who has promised that he will look into all police abuses and other such abuse towards protesters and any infringement upon their right to freely protest peacefully. Nevertheless, there is now this talk, this conspiracy, if I may use that term, at this time, about how there may be sabotage from other groups. Now, there isn't any specifics that I've seen, at least, anywhere about who those groups may be. So we're not sure about who exactly the Interior Ministry is trying to blame here. But nevertheless, this is important because al-Kadhimi has also asked the Interior Ministry and police officials for a report into exactly, A, the list of protesters who have been injured and or arrested and even killed possibly over these many months of protests, and secondly, also into exactly how they've been operating during this time as well. Let me put that to our guest who is joining us now to discuss this further. And I join with Zaydun Al-Kinani, who is a political analyst and writer. He specializes in geopolitics and identity politics with a primary focus on Iraq. He's joining us now from Doha in Qatar. Zaydun, thank you for your time today. Is this more, Zaydun, a conspiracy theory? Do you think there's some legitimacy to this argument that criminal groups, again, without specifying anybody, are at work in Tahrir Square trying to sow chaos?
Hi, Waqar. Thank you for having me again. The governmental claim to investigate the killing of peaceful protesters from this week only and ignoring the 800-plus victims who died since October 2019 is just a reflection of the governmental attempt to buy time in order to ignore the wider problem, which are the demands and the reasons why we witnessed a popular uprising rejecting the sectarian politics in Iraq's state institutions, core public services, from healthcare to education, youth unemployment, and the presence of militias in Iraq's everyday life. Now, this time-buying strategy is similar to the government's attempt in naming a new prime minister and cabinet from Jan until May this year, whilst leaving the same political parties and the same ethno-sectarian quota and the same militias that are indulging through Iraq's extreme corruption in the public sector. However, to be fair, and on the other hand, and to be fair to the entire picture here, this is most probably the first time that the Iraqi government is publicly confessing that the protesters were killed at the hands of the Iraqi security forces since the outbreak of October 2019 protests. Because the Iraqi government usually used to blame it on a third party, as they like to call it. And they continued to overuse the term third party to the extent that it was heavily picked by online sarcasm and political media comedy and irony. And that third party term today is argued by most Iraqis that it's in reference to the militias, whom are mostly the armed wings of the big political parties and most probably supported and aligned with the pro-Iran interest group camp in Iraq. Right. Considering that the protest movement's discourse, of course, was heavily focused on Iran's hegemonic and expansionist intervention in Iraq.
I wonder how much do you think will change going forward under Kadhimi, right? You've mentioned, of course, that there's been that positive move about at least now the government admitting that there have been protesters killed at the hands of security forces, et cetera. But al-Kadhimi, made, from what I've understood, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the Iranians a bit uncomfortable because he's a bit more pro-U.S., seemingly at least. That's what's being told and reported. Do you think that there is more promise in al-Kadhimi to fix things?
It's very difficult to expect a lot of changes. Kadhimi, after all, despite being a little bit different from his predecessors, he's still a prominent member of that same political class that people protested against. He was the chief of the intelligence of the very same government that attacked and killed peaceful protesters. The Iraqi uprising, October uprising, challenged the entire political order, and that's an order that is managed and militarized by political and religious parties that are utilizing the country's communal diversity into an ethno-sectarian fragmentation in order to overshadow the theft of Iraq's public money and yearly budget and the continuous corruption. So, of course, it would also be protected by foreign and regional power players who share certain common interests with those political groups. Therefore, that political establishment and its militant and regional network will not easily give up to the youth protest movement, right, which is posing a threat to their organizational and institutional existence. Some of the political parties in today's Iraq started as a militia and then transformed into a political party to elect itself in the elections, and now it holds ministries and public departments. Referring back to the third-party term, third-party term, who weren't wearing uniforms of the security forces, who were killing peaceful protesters from, street alleys and on top of the rooftops of the buildings. A lot of them are from the armed wings of those political parties whom are trying to, protect the political establishment that they're controlling. Now, of course, changing the cabinet and prime ministers for the past year due to the pressure of the protesters is, of course, a symbolic achievement. And you and I have discussed this months ago. Yeah. And it has to be acknowledged, just like pushing this new government to change its discourse from the killing of protesters being conducted by the so-called third party to finally admitting that it's the security forces is also another step forward. But that doesn't solve Iraq's drastic long-term economic insecurity and environmental issues, right? Prime Minister Kadhimi himself claimed that his government cannot be responsible for the actions of his predecessors. But therefore, that means he must act and handle issues that have more long-term instead of short-term impacts. So instead of arresting 2 or 3 police officers, whom are still not identified, by the way, to the public, so we don't even know how true that is, they have to restructure the leadership of the armed and police forces and ensure it's free of all party politics, and in particular of the muhasasa, as we call it, which is the ethno-sectarian quota rule.
Zaidun, I wonder, who benefits from this continuous, just chaos, right, and instability? Because we've just seen constant political instability of recent, right, in Iraq, in the sense that, with these protests and with the issues not being addressed, and then, this change in government, and it took a significant amount of time, as, of course, you've already alluded to. I wonder, do you think we're finally entering into a period at least of political stability, however imperfect, of course, this political system is, to at least be able to do something and to possibly address the protesters' demands?
Yeah, well, the destabilization that comes after the protest movement is just, it's a natural reaction from the same political class. They either try to do it politically or they try to do it indirectly through those militias, right? So the government can't be very, Iraq, despite the corruption and the militant presence in the Iraqi government and on the Iraqi streets, it's still a democracy, right? It's publicly a democracy. There's elections every 4 years. So they have to at least act according to a democratic style. They can't admit that they actually went out on the streets and they're arresting and killing peaceful protesters. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to, do the classical accusations to the protesters that those protesters are being funded by foreign agendas that want to destabilize Iraq. And they try to use that unity rhetoric that we have to protect Iraq from any external interventions. We have to keep the stability, as if the Iraqi stability today was offering the right public services, as if it was offering them the right healthcare, education, security. And people are not buying that anymore. You know, it's the same accusations that activists used to receive when they tried to oppose Saddam Hussein's regime. They used to accuse them, you know, for being puppets to Iran or puppets to Israel or puppets to any other country or neighboring countries that disagreed with Saddam's interests. This government is doing the same thing. Whenever you stand up against this government, they would either claim that you're ISIS sleeping cells. It doesn't mean that there aren't any ISIS sleeping cells. There are, of course, but it's just those classical prepared and ready accusations to the protesters, whom, again, are threatening the political order of that political establishment.
Just before I let you go, Zaydun, I also wanted to broach this recent foreign trip that Al-Kadhimi took, right? So he went to Tehran as well, and he met Iranian officials, including the supreme leader as well. You know, it is important, isn't it? I mean, as much as, of course, we talk about Iranian interference, influence, however we want to term it, within Iraq, it's important for Iraq to have good relations with obviously all of its neighbors, and secondly, even regional countries, right? And I mean, and take a more independent stance. Does this sort of thing achieve that? Where, like, do you think Al-Kadhimi has more of a chance of possibly taking steps towards doing that?
Yeah, well, first of all, of course, it is very important for Iraq and any other country in the world to have very good and peaceful and cooperative relations with their neighbors. You know, Iraq should have great relationships, whether it be with Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, and other neighboring countries. But as long as that relationship doesn't cost them their sovereignty, right? The issue with Iraq and Iran is not because they're too close. It's just because Iran is too involved in Iraq. Iran's presence, in a very good example, is Zarif, right? Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. When he visited Iraq a few weeks ago, I think a week and a half ago, he was meeting almost over 10 officials. He met the head of the PMF, he met the Speaker of the Parliament, he met the Prime Minister, he met the President, he met the Chief of the Judiciary Court, he met politicians from different political parties in the Parliament. Those are not regular meetings of a foreign minister who visits a country. Usually the normal diplomatic protocol is if a foreign minister comes, he either meets the foreign minister or he might even meet the head of the state if he's lucky. Just like Kadhimi did. He met a few officials, but the main purpose of the visit is for him to meet the supreme leader of Iran and the president of Iran. Yeah. But we would never imagine a foreign minister of Iraq traveling to Tehran and meeting as many Iranian officials as Zarif did in Iraq. So here's the issue. Yes, we have to maintain a good relationship with Iran, but we also have to balance a relationship which ensures the economic and the political sovereignty of Iraq. You know, the military vulnerable Iraq is a post-2003 Iraq, which had its army disbanded and a very not protected borders against its neighbors, allowed Iran to, physically and ideologically control the Iraqi political arena.
Alrighty, we'll have to leave there as a final doing, but we do sincerely, as always, appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us. That was Zaydun Kirani speaking to us there from Doha, sharing his insight with us about, this talk from the Iraqi Interior Ministry about criminal groups at work in Baghdad, possibly trying to sow chaos, and then Prime Minister Al-Kadhimi promising at some level accountability or some form of accountability. Finally, as Zaydun there said, we've had now a positive step where the government has finally admitted that security forces were responsible for the killing of many, many protesters. Nevertheless, there are, of course, many issues within the political governance structure that was brought into place ever since the fall of Saddam Hussein and the U.S. invasion and involvement in the country. That's the root cause many of the times that created this entire issue that we're seeing today. This is certainly an imperfect system, which is certainly not working for people on the ground. That's why we have people coming out and legitimately protesting for legitimate grievances again. And those are not being addressed seemingly. There's just a cycle of corruption in which all these politicians seem to be continually protecting each other instead of actually doing their jobs and serving their country. Of course, that's a generalization. I'm sure there are many within that system who are doing the best that they can as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.